Bonvenon al Hyperpolyglot aktivulo. Lernu lingvojn, pliboniĝu la mondon. Mi nomiĝas Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez kaj hodiaŭ ni parolas pri Esperanto. We're going to discuss the linguistic ideologies of Esperanto, which is to say how people who speak Esperanto, so-called Esperantophones, and people who support Esperanto, so-called Esperantists, have thought about Esperanto throughout history, and in particular how they have rationalized and justified their beliefs about Esperanto's structure and use. Stay tuned. The name Esperanto just comes from Dr. Esperanto, the pseudonym used by famous Polish linguist Ludwik Lazarus Zamenhof, who created the language from scratch in the late 1870s and early 1880s. For the purpose of this video, we're going to divide the linguistic ideologies of Esperanto into 6 different stages. Stage number 1 was when Esperanto's language planner, Zamenhof, was still alive, which is between 1887 and 1917. Now, originally, Zamenhof, as an Ashkenazi Jew, thought that there were 2 main barriers preventing people from living in peace, which were the diversity of people and the diversity of languages. And so he thought that he should create a language that incorporates elements from the Slavic and Germanic roots of Yiddish, on the one hand, and the Romance language and Greek roots of the Sephardic language, on the other hand. From this perspective, he thought all Jews will be multilingual, speaking Esperanto with their inner circle, the language of their hosting cultures in the public sphere, and their heritage language with their family members. But this project didn't quite crystallize, and so Zamenhof, in the late years of his life, had to rethink the entire language project, removing any elements of Jewishness or any references to any kind of political project. Instead, what he adopted was homaranismo, which is an Esperanto term that means the brotherhood of humanity. His idea was that Esperanto was to be a neutrally human language, which means it was open to anybody who wanted to adopt it, regardless of national or religious affiliation. In fact, in the first World Esperanto Congress organized in Boulogne-sur-Mer in 1905, there was a declaration of Esperantism, which read as follows. Article 1 states, Esperantism is the endeavor to spread worldwide the use of this neutral human language which, not intruding upon the personal life of peoples and in no way aiming to replace existing national languages, would give to people of different nations the ability to understand each other. All other ideals or hopes tied to Esperantism by any Esperantist is his or her purely private affair, for which Esperantism is not responsible. And so, since 1905, the debate within the Esperanto movement has been about what exactly neutrality means in this context. On the one hand, there was Swiss neutralism, which insisted on the fact that Esperanto create a new world order of international relations. Its key figure was Hector Hodler, who created the Universal Esperanto Association in Geneva in 1908. His aim was to create a network of consuls and cultural Esperanto centers that would serve like the British Council for English or like the Goethe Institute for German. On the other hand, there was French neutralism, according to which Esperanto was less about cosmopolitanism than it was about respecting pre-existing nations and then on top of that adding a secondary layer of identity. Its key figure was Louis de Beaufort, who founded the Society for the Propagation of Esperanto in 1898. And so, whether people chose to embrace French neutralism or Swiss neutralism, at the end of the day, Esperanto became the language of anti-chauvinism and pacifism. In historical terms, this is crucial because it ought to be understood against the backdrop of World War I, which was based largely on the notion of one land, one language, one nation. And so as it happens, Zamenhof died before World War I was over, and his last statement was very political. He published an Esperanto to English document that was released to diplomats in 1915, where he strongly advocated for the United States of Europe. He said Esperanto or any other ethnically neutral language ought to be the language of communication in this new Europe. Second stage, post-World War I. After the First World War, there are many leftists who enter the Esperanto movement. Anarchists, socialists, and communists come to see Esperanto as a proletariat language, in opposition to the bourgeois languages that are equal to national languages such as French, German, etc. And then, during World War II, totalitarianism persecuted Esperanto. So the Nazis banned Esperanto, and Stalin persecuted Esperanto supporters as suspect of passing information across the Soviet borders. In the end, many Esperanto supporters were killed in concentration camps and gulags. The third stage is post-World War II. After the Second World War, the French neutralism became prevailing in the Esperanto movement, which means that national borders were accepted as unquestionable. And as a result, you have a lot of people being termed, say, French Esperantist or Dutch Esperantist. So the belonging to a certain nation is taken for granted, and then the fact that you are a supporter or speaker of Esperanto is added on top of that. Now, there are some exceptions, for instance, with Catalonia or Scotland, both of which are not a nation state, but are still members of Esperanto Society. So there is the Catalan Esperanto Society and the Scottish Esperanto Society, which are separated from the Spanish Esperanto Society and the British Esperanto Society, respectively. The key figure of the new Universal Esperanto Association was Ivo Lapena, and he considered multilingualism as a problem and Esperanto as its solution. Consequently, he advocated for Esperanto as the language of international diplomacy. And eventually, however, he realized that English had triumphed as the language spoken on the west side of the Iron Curtain, whereas Russian had prevailed as the dominant language on the east side of the Iron Curtain. Stage number 4, the Tejo period. In 1956, a new youth movement by the name of Worldwide Esperanto Youth Organization, Tejo, started within the Universal Esperanto Association. In 1969, during a meeting of young Esperantists, the Declaration of Tiresu was signed, which positioned Esperanto supporters against imperialism and in favor of the rights of minoritized languages. The declaration read as follows: if we apply with consistency the concept of conserving the integrity of individuals, you will condemn linguistic and cultural discriminations in any form, and also the so-called solution of the language problem, which is based on discrimination. And we find that until now we have not paid enough attention to the destruction of the cultural and linguistic background of many peoples. This destruction is nothing less than a tool of linguistic imperialism. Since 1974, arguably one of the most influential speakers of Esperanto is Humphrey Tonkin, who has established a strong connection between Esperanto and the language rights movement. Now, there is of course a rather obvious paradox at stake here. On the one hand, Esperanto supporters are taking for granted the limits of nation states, and on the other, they are supporting the language rights of minoritized languages, which by definition have always played second fiddle to the major language of a nation state. Now, granted, as I've already said, there are some notable exceptions, such as the Scottish Esperanto Association and the Catalan Esperanto Associations, which are different and separate from the Spanish and the British Esperanto Associations, respectively. Stage 5, the Rauma Manifesto. In 1980, a new generation of Esperantists generated a renewed document in support of Esperanto in the city of Rauma in Finland. Now, contrary to the previous manifesto, the Rauma Manifesto insists on the idea that Esperanto doesn't need to prevail over English as an international lingua franca, and it redefines the Esperanto community of speakers as a stateless, diasporic linguistic minority based on the freedom of association. The manifesto created a hard split in the Esperanto movement between supporters of it, called Raumists, and people who were against it, called anti-Raumists. Now, in light of this situation, a new manifesto was required that would reconcile both splits in the community of Esperanto speakers. And this manifesto was mainly drafted by UNESCO officials and signed in 1996 in Prague. And it's based around 7 different principles. Now, the first point is democracy. The idea here is that because of its reduced complexity, Esperanto is much easier to learn than any other international lingua franca, such as English. Actually, what happens with English as an international lingua franca nowadays is that it leads to a kind of global diglossia, by virtue of which there is an increased gap between the elites on the one hand, those who master English, and the masses on the other hand, those who speak broke English or have difficulties expressing themselves in English. Whereas with the adoption of Esperanto as an international lingua franca, that gap will be reduced because Esperanto is much easier to learn. The second aspect is transnational education. Because Esperanto is not restricted to any ethnicity, it means that it is not confined to any given specific worldview that is tied to a particular nation. The third point of the manifesto is pedagogical efficiency. Esperanto can be mastered in a month, and in turn it facilitates the learning of further languages. Fourth point, multilingualism. All Esperanto speakers are either bilingual or multilingual, which in turn leads to broader horizons. Fifth point, linguistic rights. Esperanto circumvents the unequal distribution of power amongst languages because it allows for speakers to meet on neutral terms. Number 6, linguistic diversity. Linguistic diversity is not a problem to be solved, but rather a source of enrichment. And finally, seventh point, human emancipation. Transcending the exclusive use of national languages, Esperanto allows people to preserve their local national identities while adding on top of that a second layer of international communication. And I would like to conclude this video with certain thoughts on this longue durée of linguistic ideologies of Esperanto. Now, I would say, on the one hand, it is true that Esperanto is not tied to any particular ethnicity, and that makes Esperanto unique and very valuable, and certainly more than English, as an international lingua franca. In addition to this, the claim or the criticism that Esperanto is an artificial language, in my opinion, is an oversimplification. Why? Because why natural languages will be better than so-called artificial languages is not self-evident. In addition to this, I believe that there is no such stark distinction between so-called natural and so-called artificial languages, because languages being socio-cultural constructs, all languages are planned to some degree or another. So at the end of the day, the difference between the languages that are called natural and those that are named artificial is actually a difference of degree rather than kind. And even then, it is also a fact that there are people whose first language is Esperanto, and so on. On the other hand, what is actually problematic about Esperanto is that it is a deeply Eurocentric language. Despite what all manifestos say, Esperanto was created by Europeans for Europeans, and that goes to show particularly in its linguistic structure. Of course, it relies on a Latin script, and from a lexical and grammatical perspective, it's basically a combination of Romance languages, Greek and Slavic Germanic components. And so it's much more difficult to learn for someone whose first language is, say, Arabic or Mandarin Chinese, than for someone whose first language is Spanish or French. Now, does that mean that Esperanto is unsuitable as an international auxiliary? Not necessarily. At the end of the day, English and Spanish are profoundly international languages and are also European in their origin. What it means, though, is that we need to acknowledge the cultural bias that is implicit in Esperanto and make a critique of the forms of privilege to which it leads. So that's all from me. I hope that you learned about the linguistic ideologies underpinning Esperanto. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thanks for watching.